The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Who, oddly enough, doesn't have a opening bumper for this episode either.
Dude, this is becoming a trend. I think you got to work on your opening bumpers.
Or just have something randomly prepared.
I think so. Okay, that's your homework, dude. For next episode, I want a weird random opening bumper that's totally prepared.
Uh-oh.
Anyway, so tonight we're going to be talking about the weird gamification formula that's infecting all media. Does that sound sinister? Good, because it is. And Don's going to tell us all about it right now. Okay, Don, over to you.
It's funny that you take that position, because anybody who's listened to the show knows, like, we've talked about writing formulas before.
Just a few times.
And anybody who's listened knows that Rob's kind of a big fan of them, and I fear them because I think there's good and bad, but I think for formulas proper, there's a fair amount of bad.
Maybe.
But we ran into a thing, and if you remember the episode we did about writing formulas, there was one, I believe it was Michael Moorcock, where he had a formula that wasn't quite a formula, where he said if he's writing like a sword and sorcery story, he'd take like a day and just come up with like random terms and images and ideas and just write them all down. And that puts you in your frame of mind, and then he basically would do a quick breakdown of the story, and then you're just off and running with writing.
Right. Yeah. Well, there was one catch, though. I should bring this up. Michael Moorcock was actually breaking it down using the Dent formula. So he did actually have a formula he was using, but he was doing an extrapolated version of the Dent formula, which you can find a link to in the show notes. But the short version is basically, it's just a very simple 4-act structure where Act 1, you introduce lots of problems. Act 2, you introduce more problems. Act 3, you introduce bigger problems. And Act 4, you introduce even bigger problems. And then you just kind of solve it all together. That's basically the Dent formula. And it worked for like 183 pulp novels or something like that, written by Dent. And Michael Moorcock, apparently.
And many more written by other people, too.
Oh, yes. It's very popular.
But that idea, the way Michael Moorcock did it, it's that weird kind of nether space. It works like a writing formula, but it's something else, too.
Okay, so generally speaking, I think there's 3 ways to look at plot. Plot is content, plot is structure, and plot is formula. Content means you're looking at plot as just the stuff that's in it, the content, but not actually how to put it together, how to organize it. Formula means you have a specific formula that usually tells you what goes where and what's supposed to be there. And then there's plot as structure, where it's basically, here's the structure, the framework that you can use, but it doesn't tell you really the content. You can just decide what you want to go in there. And those are 3 different ways that I can see of looking at plot. So what you're talking about there is plot as formula, I guess, because that's really what Michael Moorcock is basically doing. He's basically, like you said, he's piggybacking on the whole Dent thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's in a weird kind of plug and play sort of way. That he's inserting certain ideas or concepts into that basic structure and then kind of filing off the rough spots and ta-da, story.
Exactly. Well, guess what? That's what the majority of genre fiction is. That's how it's written.
Because that's getting at a weird thing that I noticed a little while ago. I had inklings of, but it kind of, 2 things kind of came together and put this idea that there's this sort of in between not quite writer's formula, not quite writing technique that a lot of different writers nowadays have glommed onto?
There are usually a few different approaches. Often they're very intuitive, like they've kind of figured out on an intuitive level that other writers are doing it and they copy it, but they don't know exactly what the other writers are doing, or they just kind of have a vague idea. That's probably one of the things you've cottoned onto, and that they've glommed onto, as the case may be. All right, so
it's interesting that you're specific about that.
Well, I have to be. It's important to be specific when we're talking about formula. Thank you very much. All right. So let's stop being vague and beating around the bush here, and let's just take a look at it. So what do you got in the box?
Okay, because you've hit upon, I think, why this has proliferated. Because I was thinking about when we had Justin on talking about when he was at home in Trinidad. He talked about how he was inspired by video games.
Right.
And how that the way that the role-playing games especially were structured and the way the plots came out made a big impact on him when he was younger.
Makes sense.
And I thought about that because I was going through, anybody again who's listened to the show knows I have a bit of a problem with old school role-playing games. And I'd recently come into a collection of old White Dwarf magazines. Like super old. And I have an obsession with the old white box D&D. And the earliest White Dwarves had a lot of how to set up your campaign, a lot of analyses of the rules, because anybody who's tried to play white box D&D knows it's kind of half a set of rules.
Right.
There's a lot of like intuitiveness that went on back in the day. And this is people filling it in. And a big focus for old school D&D was balancing the challenge of the encounter versus the group. And there's tons of different systems that came out. And even today with the newer versions, it's always, how do I make the monsters challenging enough to be a fight, but not like a guaranteed stomp on the group? And when you put those two ideas together, you get, and this is what we've referred to as kind of the gamification of story. You get this weird kind of formula that since, I'd say go back to like, say, the late 70s, starts coming out in a lot of entertainment, especially action-based stuff. Where what happens is the plot is structured like a game.
Okay, how so?
Well, what you get in your old school D&D, you get it kind of backwards, where the idea is, because the game is perpetual and it's from the player's point of view, as their characters advance and go up in level and get new abilities, you're always trying to match monsters and the threat to their current level. You get that in like the not old school, middle school video games, like in the 80s when the role-playing games start taking off. Because you've got the technology to do more than it's red cube, it's blue cube.
Right.
You get this idea that the nature of the story changes as your character advances, because again, you go up, you get new abilities, the monsters get tougher. A lot of the old monsters kind of just vanish. Like, that was another statuism. How come when I turn 5th level, all the orcs disappear? Well, because you've killed them all. That's how you got to 5th level.
Exactly.
But
it's all dead. Thanks, statue.
It's that idea that what's happening is you're doing kind of a materialist version of the hero's journey, where the character is advancing in power and ability, and the plot and universe following along is developing in relation to the power level of your character, or the character, the main character.
Right. Okay, that's an interesting idea. And I can pretty clearly see what you mean. Yeah, okay. That the universe is always roughly at the same difficulty level as your character can handle. Maybe just a tiny bit harder than they can handle.
Yeah, and what ends up happening too is, because of the nature of games, be them tabletop games or the video game role-playing games, they were generally written from encounter to encounter to encounter. So like in a video game, you would play the battle of such and such a field, and that would get you to the town. And in a town, you'd buy the equipment that would get you through the mountain pass, that would get you to the kingdom of like evil King Floyd. And then you'd beat King Floyd. And then it would be another, but it's all based on these challenges. You're going, it's not a plot. It's you beat this guy up, then you go to the guy who's tougher, and then the guy who's tougher after that.
Right, yeah.
Like, that's the very gamer formula. And what I was thinking on that I noticed is when you get to like the late 70s, especially with like your action films, your cop TV shows and that, they start doing that.
That's true. And I think I might have a reason for it, but continue. I'll tell you about that in a second.
Okay, but it's that idea that what you start seeing is the hero begins like hunting down the bad guys. He becomes like a vigilante inevitably. He shakes down like the local hustler to find out where the gang meets. He beats up the gang and beats up their leader, who then tells him where like the guy that supplies them with their drugs that they're selling to kids in the schools is. And he goes and beats that guy up, and then that guy's a little tougher, and that guy tells him where the big boss is, and he shows up, and then he gets into a fight with the big boss, and it's always a fight. It's never that like the weird old middle-aged guy who's in charge of the crime organization is a thinker. At this point, he's always like a combat monster, and you have to fight him, or barring that, he has an unstoppable muscle-bound Freddie Mercury clone that you have to kick the ass of.
Yep, that's it. That's the formula, all right.
And that's a clever Commando reference for anybody playing it on.
Yep.
And you get that kind of thing as it becomes codified as a formula, because if you go back to older action stories and older detective stories and that, they weren't quite that pat.
Usually the older stuff is a sequence of the hero getting the shit kicked out of him from encounter to encounter, but he manages to kind of lumber his way through, and then finally at the end kind of gets his bearings and comes around and wins, basically. But it's usually him losing a whole lot until he finally wins. Again, Lester Dent formula.
Yeah, and it's also the idea that the opposition isn't as stratified most of the time. Like, you'll meet the main villain early in the story, and then it's the hero being one step behind the main villain.
That's true.
It's not that you're going from like scene to scene,
working your
fighting
way up.
Fighting progressively more competent bad guys.
Yep. And do you want to know where this actually comes from? You think it's from gamification. You might be right, but I actually have a different take on it.
Okay.
It's from old kung fu movies.
I was thinking
the 70s is basically the era of the kung fu movie. And if you watch kung fu movies from the 60s and 70s, as I have watched many, you will see this is exactly how they all function. And in fact, one could make a very good argument that what's really going on in video games, actually, because a lot of them are from Japan and that, right, is actually what they've gotten also from the kung fu formula, because it's so perfect and it works so well. There's always a main bad guy who's a badass, but first, before then, you have to work your way through his minions before you can finally get to him. And that's what, and the movie will basically be the hero getting beat up at the beginning, and then he trains a bunch, and he comes back and begins working his way through the minions until he finally faces the bad guy at the end. He defeats the bad guy, roll credits, movie's over. Literally, that's how there's not even a denouement or anything like that. It's literally the end will suddenly come up if you watch an old Shaw Brothers film.
Right.
And it's like, okay, as you're literally watching the bad guy like fall onto the ground, it would just go the end, and you'll see the hero turn around and just walk away from the camera. Because they know the moment that fight is over, the story is over. The story is really just about them wading their way through each level of bad guys until they reach the tough guy at the end, and they win. Now, I know this was going on in the 70s, I believe some of the 60s. Now, some of the earlier movies are a little bit different. I'm not quite sure, because I'm not quite I'm going to make a bad reference here, but I'm not quite the kung fu movie master that could tell you these exactly what point this started at with what film. I know there are guys out there like that, and hopefully we'll get to interview one in the near future. But I think the kung fu movies are where this comes from.
I think you're right. There's a Western equivalent as well,
right?
Because a lot of the old horse operas followed that kind of formula.
Yeah, they do.
But there's one odd little, I guess, little twist that they still tended to do, but before, say, the late 70s, was that you would be introduced to all of the obstacles right away.
Right.
That it would be like, for the Kung Fu movie, you'd see like the evil warlord, and you would meet his, like, 7 savage monkeys that would be his troop of Kung Fu actors, and then the hero would meet them one by one.
Right, yeah.
But you'd get that up front. It's the same thing like the old Westerns, Marshall, the Shaw brothers have gone up to the hill, and they're Kung Fu experts for some reason, because you mentioned Shaw brothers, and it stuck with me.
Sorry.
But it would be something like that, and usually they would be pretty linear, like the newer version, but there'd be some kind of extra bit of kind of circular action to it.
Yeah, I mean, I was just watching a show called The Rebel Johnny Yuma recently. I don't know if you've probably heard of Johnny Yuma, because it was this show that was done with, I believe it was Nick Adams, I think, starred in it before he went off and hung out with giant monsters. And it's from like either the late 50s or early 60s. Anyway, Shout Factory has it on their website. If you can watch Shout Factory TV or through your Roku or whatever, like one of those streaming services, they can, anyway, they have it on there. And so I was watching like the first episode of that, and I found it interesting because what they're basically doing was the Kung Fu formula. He comes into town. The town is being ravaged by this bad guy and his gang of thugs. And he immediately encounters the thugs and, develops bad blood with them. And then he finds out that these people are like, terrorizing this town where he grew up. I'm going to spoil the hell out of this, but I don't think that really matters. It's like 60-year-old spoilers, folks, deal with it. But then what basically the short version is, the regular formula happens, though. Once he finds out what's really going on, he begins working his way through the bad guys until eventually he has a duel with the main bad guy, and he wins, and then he rides off into the sunset. Because that's a Western, basically. So I think that formula is there even on the American side right from the beginning. But I think that the Asians, especially the Chinese Kung Fu movies, they really stratified the hell out of that formula. Like, they were really into the working your way up. Whereas the Western version usually does involve, like, okay, there's the whole gang, and he might be working his way through the gang, but really there's just, like, standard gang member and the boss, and there's only those 2 levels, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas and he'll have to go through the gang members to get to the boss, but again, there's only the 2 levels. Whereas the Asian stuff, they'll be like low-level dickweeds, medium-level dickweeds, to use your parlance. Then there'll be like lieutenants, and then there'll be the main boss.
Right.
And so there's all these different levels, and the main character has to work their way through those levels to get somewhere. Well, to get to the end.
Yeah. I think part of that, too, though, is because, and we've talked about this before, that the Asian mindset opposed to the Western one believes in hard work and likes to see that the hero has to work and improve and develop.
Right.
And when you talk about martial arts, most martial arts have a rating system that you do have a rank.
They do. And do you know where that comes from? Go. Referring to the game, Go. Because I noticed that when I first started playing Go many years ago, is that also known as Wei Chi in Chinese or Baduk in Korean. But Go is the game with black and white stones where you take turns putting them down on a board and try to surround each other. It's called the surrounding game for a reason. For those who didn't know. Anyway, short version is this, and I noticed that their ranking system works exactly like the ranking system of most martial arts. And then I thought, oh, that's interesting. But when I did research on the history of Go, I discovered, no, the martial arts got it from Go. Not the other way around. Because it's a very simple, very logical system, which is basically there's one set of ranks for beginners and there's one set of ranks for masters. And you kind of just work your way up to, that's what working your way up to a black belt is in, say, karate. Black belt is the beginning master rank, basically, and where you're actually good at it. And then there's all these ranks above that. And that's how Go works as well, where there's a bunch of lower ranks and then there's kind of this midpoint and a bunch of upper ranks. There's the learner rank and the master rank, basically.
Yeah, and it's weird because that's something like, say, in the West, especially for our stories, that we never did anything like that. Here, you either are the hero or you aren't.
Right.
And typically, we may do an origin. So you go back to the old like cowboy flicks. It's always that the hero is like the mild-mannered farmer guy, and then the outlaws murder his family, and he's got to pick up the gun and learn how to shoot. And it's that idea: you're a gunfighter or you're not.
Yeah.
And it's like you say again. At that point, when you enter that realm, you become the hero. It's the same thing too when we do like superheroes. Superheroes are you're a normal until you're bathed in like nuclear waste, and then you have powers, and now you're a hero.
Yes.
And it's I think part of that is because of the West's idea of rugged individualism. We do kind of see heroic traits as an internal thing that you have them or you don't.
Right.
It's that same idea why we can be and you see it in like the Westerns. He's yellow. Well, it's an inherent thing. You don't learn that sort of behavior. You don't really learn to be the hero. Even if you have to learn the skill of gunfighting, something happens, you become the hero, you go out for revenge. And then, like you say, the bad guys always kind of work the same way too, that you've got the supreme villain, you've got like your Darth Vader, and then there's like everybody else. And they're all pretty equal, unless you've got dickweeds, and even then your dickweeds are probably not that. They're either comedy relief or they're not that worse than the lieutenants. To stick with the Star Wars example, you look at like the galaxy's biggest badass, Boba Fett, who gets accidentally whacked in the ass by a stick by a blind dude and eaten by a giant desert vagina. So
yeah, but they're making up for that by giving him a whole new series called The Mandalorian next year.
Yeah, how did that poster put it? He's dead, fanboys, deal. But again, it's that weird idea that he's kind of just a fancy stormtrooper.
Yep.
Even though he gets a name. Same thing with like a lot of like the other ones. They're doing it with like the new ones with Captain Phasma, who dies at least once in every movie, but for some reason she's the ultimate Boba Fett. You know,
she keeps coming back because I don't know.
Just because it's a Star Wars thing. The cooler your armor looks, the more vulnerable you get. Exactly. But again, it's this idea that we don't up until you get to the 70s, you don't really start separating the competency like ranks of our hero. You're the hero or you're not.
True. I'd never thought about that, but you're right. The American concept is you're either special or you're not.
Yeah. Or something happens that makes you special, like an accident.
Yes. Well, that's the whole idea that anyone can be special if luck bestows upon them her virtues. Okay, that's an interesting idea. I mean, I can't say that the Japanese or the Asian approach is really that different. I mean, most of the kung fu stuff, I mean, yes, there's the learning process, but they always have the potential to begin with. And yes, they do have to go through a learning process, usually, not always, but usually. But in the end, you're either a martial artist and you're special or you're not. I mean, there are ranks and grades within it, but but one could argue even within Western stuff, there are ranks and grades about how, you know, some guys are tougher than others.
They kind of are, and this is where I think you start getting into this gamification, and you get into some of the problems that it causes, because we don't like to have our heroes ever at a disadvantage.
That's true.
And this ties in with like the D&D thing. So what you're watching, if you're watching a story where the hero is actually progressing and he's making his way through the tougher villains, they're always just at that threshold where if he pushes a little bit, he wins.
Yeah.
There's very few up until recently, and there was tons before, because it was that idea, like you said, an old school action film, the hero would look like hell by the end of it.
Usually, yeah. Die Hard is a good example of that.
Kind of, but Die Hard, again, the one I'm thinking of, was it Where Eagles Dare?
Right.
with Clint Eastwood where they almost drop him off a gun and he just looks horrible. Because he just gets his ass handed to him through that whole film.
Yep.
Die Hard's a good example of kind of what we got when they started splitting the difference, because it looks like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because he does start it getting some wear and tear, but it doesn't actually affect him.
That's true. He does run around awfully well for a man who's got feet completely cut up by glass.
Yeah, and he kicks in a plate glass window with those like badly damaged feet too, and then manages to still take out the bad guy.
Yeah, it's a valid point. As I always say, he's the poster boy for hit points. Where all the damage is just superficial because he hasn't reached zero yet or gotten low enough.
Well, and after every encounter, he gets more XP, so he goes up a level and gets a couple extra ones.
Maybe he's in one of those systems where he's actually getting a completely new set of XP every time he goes up a level. There are those too.
That's true. Well, if it's the video game model, a lot of them, when you go up a level, you're completely like healed up.
Yep.
But that again, it's weird that we can look at that. I think what you're seeing when you see that kind of more gamerish formula being applied to stuff is the beginnings of what leads to the litRPG thing.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that's on the Western side of things. You should see what things look like on the Asian side right now. Because, of course, that's my area of interest. Oh, my God. Everything now, not everything, but so much is all based around gamification and gamer logic and things. Like so many comics and video games and books and all that. Everything runs on game world logic.
Yeah.
Like everything. The setting usually has, they don't even hide it. The setting just has rules like a game. That's how it works now.
Yeah. Well, there's part of that too, say, especially in Japan, and I think most of Asia, where you get that as the first really big example of that was Dragon Ball.
You think Dragon Ball ran like a game?
It does when you get into what became Dragon Ball Z.
Oh, that's true. Okay.
Because it literally became a game. Remember, because when the Vegeta and the other guys show up, they have those scanners.
Yeah, it's over 9,000!
Yeah, and they're doing that. His powers reach 18,000! And then you can tell when they go up a level because they get a different hairstyle.
Right.
And it's that, again, that role-playing game, that video game thing given form. And I think, again, because looking at like how litRPGs started taking off, say, within the last decade or so, I think you're looking at the next generation that when you get to, say, the Dragon Ball era, you've got enough people that are familiar with, say, video games and role-playing games, that it's starting to sneak into how things are done.
It is, yeah. And
then you get that feel, and then eventually it just goes full-blown because people are saying, well, no, this is kind of working like a video game, and why don't we just go for broke and run with that?
I don't even think it's that deep. I think that what we're getting into now is we're just getting an entire generation that was raised on games that were more advanced than Pong, like you and I were, that have literally grown up with the Dragon Ball formula and the video game formula that's like post-1990s and such. And as an end result, to them, especially the current generation, games are just like the most normal thing in the world. Games are such a fundamental part of their life or childhood, youth, whatever, that when they go to write stuff, they just naturally write it like a game. I mean, to them, their greatest storytelling experiences, they didn't read novels, they didn't read comic books even. They played games. That is their storytelling experience. And I'm not talking D&D when I say these games. I'm talking like World of Warcraft or Skyrim or other games like that, where they're great, or BioShock there are many other Red Dead Redemption. There's a whole bunch of these other video games that have come out in the last like decade or 2 decades, really, that had major story elements to them. And to a lot of gamers, I've noticed that's a story, basically.
Right.
One of the things I have to do when I'm teaching script writers at the school in my script writing classes, I have to actually, how can I put this, strongly dissuade them and explain why writing like a video game is a really bad idea. Because it doesn't work very well. not in terms of like drama, because it's just about characters going through mowing things down. It's not really all that dramatically interesting.
I don't know. It worked for Toriyama.
Yes, but Toriyama's doing a lot of other things to make that interesting. Toriyama's using a lot of tricks. There are a lot of tricks that the Japanese use, which we can go into in another podcast, that they're using to liven it up and keep it interesting and make it interesting, even when, properly speaking, the actual plot is basically just drop dead, boring, kind of dull. And it's not really, look, the characters are beating each other up. They're beating each other up again. They're beating each other up again. Oh, look, and this one's getting more powerful. Oh, look, blue hair. And that's kind of, that's all he does. But there are two things. One, he was the first guy to do it.
Right.
Not exactly the first guy, but he was one of the first guys to do it.
I think he was the first one that openly did it.
I think so, yeah. And two, like I said, he's doing some other characterization tricks and things like that to make it more lively and interesting. Like he's doing a pretty good job of mixing it up and keeping it interesting as we go along. So I would argue that, yeah, Toriyama set the standard and set the flow, but not everyone who follows that. How can I put this? Okay, here. The characterization in a video game is drop dead boring, okay? Because video game characters are meant to be surrogates for the reader, okay? Right. And even the more quote-unquote advanced video game characters, I'm going to put those in air quotes, are still basically just reader surrogates. They're drop dead boring, bland characters because the reader is supposed to be injecting themselves into the character and injecting themselves into the fun, okay? So the character is dull, and the action is mostly from twists and turns as you blow stuff up and beat stuff up.
Right.
Okay, but that's not very interesting unless there's an interactive component to make that work. And that's what you need: interesting characters, which Dragon Ball kind of has, and you need some interesting action and stuff mixing it up. You can make the fighting stuff work, but you need those interesting characters to make it work in fiction when there's not that interactivity to add that extra zest to the whole thing.
I think you're onto something.
But you don't quite agree with me.
Well, because I can think of two examples that they kind of confound your theory.
Okay.
Not the core of it, but the idea of needing that for the audience. Because when you talk about a game, a video game or role-playing game, what you're getting at is the level of vicarious participancy. That it is much higher in any kind of game because I'm making some kind of decision. I'm actually taking part in the action.
Exactly.
And in some small way, there's a consequence to me of how that action turns out.
Yes. In theory.
If the character gets killed, I got to go back to a save point, kind of thing. When you write a story, you don't necessarily get that, but I'm wondering, there's some other kind of psychological effect that we're missing, because two examples I can think of, one Eastern, one Western.
Okay, go for it. Let's hear them.
So many Isekai stories are basically just a role-playing game where, like you say, the character is a stand-in for the reader or the viewer, if it's animated. And the characters tend to be kind of these like really, really bland kind of like reader, I don't know if associate or input or.
They're avatars for the reader is what they are. They're reader surrogates. They're basically surrogates for the reader.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best term for it. And that kind of comes out of that video game tradition. It's a video game with all the danger parts taken out. And on the Western side, that's what a lot of like 80s and early 90s action films were.
Okay, what do you mean?
That the hero again was in a way a surrogate for the audience because they were very bland and typical, and there wasn't much to them except that, they defied authority and caused a lot of property damage and never went to jail for it for some reason.
Right.
And it's that idea that both those cases, because you're writing characters like that, should be boring as hell, but for some reason they touch off that vicarious participancy node that made them that style. Like the Isekai is disturbingly popular in Japan, and the 80s action hero was disturbingly popular like here in the 80s, and they keep trying to bring it back. So there's something else there. There's another way to make that connection to the audience without making the character an entity, I guess. That, again, they're surrogates for the audience in some capacity. And you're getting some weird vicarious thrill from it, even though logic says you shouldn't.
Well, okay. One of the things that's happening there, and I'd say that it's happening with both the Isekai and the 80s action flicks, is that they're using what I call righteous Avenger plots. I'm not sure if we talked about that in the show before. Maybe we did. I don't know. Short version is a righteous Avenger plot is usually a plot where the bad guys are really, really evil, and usually are evil to a whole bunch of really nice people. And then the main character is basically just there to kick their ass. That's pretty much it, and make them pay. And the most of the story is usually really about the villain and the innocents, usually, who are getting terrorized. The hero is pretty much just a blank. The hero is just there to be an observer and to deliver justice onto the bad guys. This formula, it gets used all over the place. I mean, a lot of American comic books use this formula. In fact, American pulp stories use this formula sometimes. But yeah, basically the whole point is that the main character is not actually the focus of the story. They're not really that important. They're not the thing that's driving the story. They're just kind of wandering through it, mowing down bad guys who really deserve it.
Right.
Okay. And the audience is totally cool with that. They actually think that's lots of fun. And that's what a lot of Isekai stories is. That's what 80s action movies are. You know, because that's the thing. The bad guy will always do really horrible stuff at the beginning. Here, it's the Death Wish formula. If you want another blatant example of it. You know, the bad guys come in, they kill and rape the hero's family, and the rest of the movie is basically the hero going through exacting revenge on those bad guys. Does the hero have any great plot? Do they have any great motivation, character, arc, hero's journey? Bullshit. None of that shit. They are there to do one thing, which is to make those bad guys pay. And we, the audience, are there to watch and enjoy as those bad guys pay and to see how the hero will do it.
Right.
And I would argue that's the vicarious element of it. We want to see the bad guys pay, and we stick around to see how they pay, basically.
Right. Huh. Okay.
So that's my take on it anyway. I mean, if you've got another take, I'm all ears. But I think that's the formula that I've noticed that a lot of the Isekai run on. And when I think back, I think that's how the 80s action movies work too.
Yeah, they did. But you kind of had, for like 80s action movies, and this is something where I think, again, I don't know if it ties in with gaming or not, or if it's a parallel. It might be a parallel thing. That you got this weird thing that when you got to the 80s action movie, a lot of the questionable bits, the scary bits, the dangerous bits got filed off. Because again, like we said, that was the idea that in the 80s, the villains threatened to do things.
Right.
Like they wouldn't brutally murder your family. They would kidnap your family and threaten to murder them.
Well, because that you have the happy ending where you rescue them at the end.
But that's what I mean. That it went further that way. It's again, we talked about that weird kind of movie ecology that say in a Death Wish, like the first one or two were out of all 58 or however many they did. The bad guys did bad things, like horrible, unforgivable things. So there was a morality to the hero gunning them down in horrible, violent ways.
Exactly. If you don't have the bad guys doing horrible things, then the good guy is a complete psycho.
Yeah, and then that's
just another bad guy.
Yeah, and then that's what you start seeing happening like in the 80s, because they take away that consequence to the hero. Where, like I said, you mentioned Die Hard. Well, in Die Hard, the bad guys didn't kill McClane's wife. They threatened to kill his wife. Whereas in Death Wish, they like murdered his family, beat up his like housekeeper, and raped his dog. Like it's this idea that you're still kind of getting that thrill, but the negative part that makes it cathartic starts getting filed off. So it's like you said, the hero's more and more just a psycho. So you're just getting the thrill of this guy beating up the villain. There's nothing that makes you think, well, they really deserved it. Or,
well, can I interrupt for a sec? I think you're 100% right. I'm agreeing with everything you said. I think that there are a few factors, however, to take into account. One, when Death Wish was basically meant to be a quasi, I can't call it underground, but basically it's a low budget exploitation action film, right? It's meant to be brutal, it's cheap, it's even in the 70s, it wasn't meant to be high cinema or a general audience, basically.
Yeah.
Whereas the action movies that follow it in the 80s are meant to be general audience movies. Okay, so there's a limit to what they can do in terms of the bad guy actually doing bad stuff, because this is the thing you got to remember is that I think it was in the 80s, they introduced the new motion picture codes that come down because of violence in cinema and such. I think 81, 82, maybe as late as 83 anyway. And anyway, somewhere in the early 80s, they introduced a new motion picture code. And immediately what happens is you got all these malls opening up, because this is the age of malls. It's the 80s. And all these malls have cinemas in them, which is awesome. Okay, so you can go to local cinema. But they're family-friendly cinemas. They can't show anything R-rated. So if you have R-rated content in your movie and you receive an R-rated content, your movie has just lost millions of dollars. This is the 80s. Only millions, not tens of millions. Whatever. The point is that what's happened is, and this is written into the theater's contracts with the mall, that they can't show anything that's not quote-unquote family-friendly. This is one of the reasons why PG-13 was created, if I remember right. It was to slip things in that couldn't be shown in venues that weren't allowed to show R-rated films, so they created PG-13 in the States. We don't have that here in Canada, as a way to slip in what really should be R-rated content or more mature content into a place that couldn't show R-rated films. All right?
Yeah, kind of. It wasn't necessarily like R-rated stuff, but PG-13 came out because they said, well, we want to make a movie and we show tits, but no actual genitals. And there's a little bit of blood, but nobody gets a head cut off. So we don't think we deserve quite an R rating, even though it's maybe a little more than PG. And that's what PG-13 was. It was supposed to be something with a little more bite than.
Yeah, I remember when PG-13 actually did have, more mature content. I believe there's a video about that on YouTube. I'll see if I can track it down. There's a great video about how PG-13 evolved and changed over time, and how it was once stuff that was actually really strong, but then later on it became stuff that was just as weak as regular PG movies, basically. But that's not the point. The point is, in order to meet that criteria, the thing that they did, and this is the same thing they did in 80s cartoons, which always pissed me off. They kept in all the violence, but they took out all the consequence.
Yeah.
And this is where we get into more quasi-gamification, so you end up with the heroes who are doing lots of violent things and the villains who are doing lots of violent things, but nobody actually gets hurt because they're not allowed to have that consequence in a kid's cartoon. But even the adult stuff, like A-Team, for example, 10 million rounds are fired off every episode, but not a single one actually hits a human being.
Yeah.
And no, they build some weird contraption out of a lawnmower and 2 golf carts, and that's what they use to take down the bad guys. Not the fact that they are loaded to bear and have like 50 guns. No, we wouldn't actually use that to hurt the bad guys. I mean, that would be wrong. So again, it's more, and again, why did they do that? It's because they couldn't do that on primetime network TV.
Well, there's I think catches with that too, though, because if you look at primetime TV during that era, like just before that, like the cop shows and that were always having somebody getting like gunned down. There wouldn't be any blood, but you'd always see these like big shootouts and the bad guy would be like, and grab his like oddly unmarred and unripped suit and fall down and stuff. Yeah,
but that's a Western tradition, and it's something that the generation that existed who grew up on Westerns wouldn't care about. As long as there's no actual blood and the guy goes, and falls over, that's not really murder. That's not really that bad. It's just, okay, yeah, it's a murder and everything, but it's a fake theatrical murder and we all know it and we all just go with it.
Yeah.
But you couldn't show that on, say, G.I. Joe, the cartoon, for example, because, again, kids show, you weren't allowed to show that stuff.
Yeah.
Or at least they weren't willing to risk trying to show it, as the case may be. Because you could show it. It happened on Robotech all the time, and they translated Japanese stuff all the time. So apparently you could run it, at least in syndication. It's just they chose not to.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
so, anyway, but going back to my point is, so they took out the consequence, which basically removed all the real bite from everything.
Yeah, I think what happened to theirs is how that happens is because it starts becoming the tap dance. That especially, say, with movies, you're wanting that bigger audience. Mm-hmm. And that was why action movies in the 80s really change. Mostly because of Commando.
Commando, yeah.
It made all the money, and it was a cartoon. And then everybody did that because you still had ultra violence in like your slasher flicks. Mm-hmm. But those tended to be really cheap and weren't trying for a general audience. You were trying for like horny teenagers at the drive-in.
Exactly. They were intended for a very specific non-mall audience. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. They weren't meant for a family-friendly environment. And so that was okay. And that's what happened. Everything that had bite moved to the alternative cinema, so to speak. And everything that was in the mainstream had to be sanitized.
Yeah.
And so we ended up with what you call the gamification effect. But I really think that what we're just looking at is a sanitization effect really there, where they're just making it simpler and safer and more family friendly because that's how you make the money. And this is a business.
Yeah. Now, do you think maybe, because what I'm going to say kind of in the other way, where I think there's still some kind of weird psychological component. When you go to Japan, you look at all the Isekai stories, the character ending up in this alternate world, in a lot of ways becomes a safety thing.
In what way?
Well, by isolating them, you take away a lot of risk and consequence for them.
You do. Well, the risk and consequence you're taking away is social risk and social consequence.
Yeah, to a large degree.
Because remember, that's important to Japanese and Japanese culture. They are heavily weighed down by the society around them in a way that North Americans aren't. And all actions are seen to have social consequences and reactions. So a character in an isekai world is truly free.
Right.
This is one of the reasons why Japanese become hikomori and basically hide in their parents' basement and refuse to come out, or parents, whatever, hide in their parents' apartment and refuse to come out until they're like 36. And their parents have already moved away 5 years ago. Because they just don't want to deal with this world and this incredible social pressure that they feel from this world around them.
Yeah, there's that too. And when you see the hero ending up in this alternate world, in most cases, what's happened now is they don't have like a family to kidnap. They don't have a dog to rape. They don't have like,
well, that's not quite true. No, I don't mean about the dog raping part. I mean that because I've never seen a dog get raped in isekai, but who knows? I haven't read all of them. So
now that you've said it, it's going to happen. Rule 34.
Well, there is that. I've seen lots of horrible things in isekai, but dogs getting raped is not one of them. And I don't want to have this conversation. All right, so
moving on,
moving right along. No, what happens in isekai is the following. Basically, the character gets dumped into another world, and they immediately develop a new family, basically, who are a bunch of friends and guides who are basically going to help them and are sympathetic to them in one form or another, and will eventually get kidnapped and threatened and everything else that would happen to a normal family. All right. But it's this new safe family of their choosing that are all love them for who they are and appreciate their interests for who they are. And in an isekai, inevitably, whatever nerdly hobby you're into is the most important thing ever in the fantasy world that you go to. It can be playing Tiddlywinks, and Tiddlywinks will be the game of kings that they use to solve all their problems in isekai land, apparently.
Well, there's another catch to that, too.
That's called No Game, No Life, by the way. It's a real show.
I was thinking about that abridged version.
Oh, the abridged version, yes. Yeah, you've seen it, right? Yeah.
One of the greatest things ever. But there's another catch to that, too. And this is where I say it strikes me as being a writing technique that comes out of gaming, because that new family are always other first level characters. So
yes, they are.
It's not like I'm the former earthly high school guy that just ends up in this world and I'm hanging out with a bunch of other clueless urchins. One of them, like the guy who invariably rips him off of something when he gets there and he catches, is the good-natured thief. And then the first of his wife, who is always like the healer who only has like the bare minimum of the spells. And then he always meets like the slow-witted weapons expert who's just kind of, and they're a player group. They're meeting at the inn. Like, it's literally every D&D group ever in every one of these stories. And that's where I say it's a weird, ultra-specific trope that you see. And it goes back to the same thing, like when you look at the a lot of the old action stories, and that it's always the same idea that our hero, whoever his like partner or buddies are, if he has them, because in the West you don't always, a lot of times it's a one-man show, but even his partner, who's getting too old for this shit, is the bureaucrat who's skilled at running interference with the chief. And maybe he picks up like his informant on the street that, you know, is the Weasley little thief guy, but he knows stuff and gets them in places. And again, it's that weirdly specific old school gaming kind of formula that really takes off after a certain point.
Well, I would argue that in almost everything, there are certain side characters that appear. I mean, and I'm not just talking about the hero's journey approach. There are certain like character roles that you actually need for the main character usually to succeed in whatever it is they're doing. So, all right. So in any story, pretty much, you're going to need the following characters, or the following roles, I should say, need to be played by someone. And they can be multiple people or single people even. There needs to be an ally. In other words, there needs to be a character that the main character can open up to and actually voice their thoughts to. Because this is how we discover what the main character actually thinks if we're not actually inside their head, which in film is really tough and gets kind of red and dark in there. So in other words, there are characters that exist to get to, for the main character to act as kind of like a sounding board with, and to get them open up. There's usually some kind of motivator character who is there to basically cause them to do stuff. This can be someone who gets kidnapped, or this can be someone who gives them orders to do something, whatever. There also needs to be a resource character who provides the character with the stuff they need. So for example, the thief is often a character who provides the main character with the stuff they need at crucial points to actually get it done. How did they get it? They stole it. But that's the thing. They're a resource gatherer. That's what they are. There's usually some character that's actually learning from the main character in some way, especially in ones where the main character doesn't change much. Usually there'll be some kind of innocent character who is looks up to the main character and is basically experiencing a story through their eyes in some way. Or often we're experiencing the main character's story through their eyes. It depends on the story. Anyway, there's some kind of, and then usually there's some kind of like comic relief character who's there to actually help them, like break up the tension and everything, and to keep things from getting too serious and to keep things going. And so you have these kinds of support roles that exist, and someone usually needs to play them. It can be one character, or it can be 5 characters or 6 or whatever. But you will have the main character will be surrounded by these people in some way. For example, you mentioned the healer chick that the main character almost always meets at the beginning when he goes off to another land. Well, congratulations. That is a love interest character, which is also another role that I didn't mention. And that's also a resource character. What's the resource? Health. And usually often information as well. That's the thing, right? When you go off to Isekai land, you need a guide. And the first character the main character meets is usually a guide, and also usually their first waifu, as you put it as well. And usually a female healer character or a female warrior character. That's the other kind. If the character themselves is a badass, it's a healer. So it's support. If the character themselves, the main character that goes there, is a wuss, it will be a warrior character that he'll meet. His first wife will be a warrior character who will basically help protect him. So that they can have action adventures and there's someone to actually keep his ass from dying. until he gets strong enough in magic or tiddlywinks or whatever to actually be able to defeat the foes himself and save her, and that's a whole big thing in and of itself.
Yeah, and the weird thing too with a lot of the isekai stuff and anything done from like the 90s on, like even a lot of stuff we do here, you see this in certain science fiction and that the team has that, you can see a definite progression of ability for everybody on the team.
Right, yep. And because they're all staying at the same level.
Well, compared to each other, but they're all getting better as they go up and work their way through the increasingly higher level encounters.
Yep. They have to, otherwise they die.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. That's like I say, it's a weird specific trope because we always had this back in the day. Like I'm thinking again, Lester Dent was Doc
Savage.
Doc Savage and his team, what were they? The Irregulars, was it?
Yep, something like that, yeah.
And they were all specialists as well.
Yep.
But the old formula that we always had was Doc was always the leader and the most massive macho guy of all. Mm-hmm. And nobody seemed to get better at anything. They were all already we've assembled a team of the world's greatest experts of everything you'd ever coincidentally have to run into. And why do we have an accordion player? Somehow that's going to be important during your adventure. Okay.
Exactly. But the thing is, they're the world's greatest experts. They can't progress because they're already there.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. That's the kind of thing that you see change for us in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And like I said, again, Japan always kind of had that, except that the hero would always outgrow the team. Mm. Except when you start getting into like the 2000s for Japan and that, you start seeing that idea of the team that they're all developing, that it's looking more and more like a gaming group.
Well, again, gaming had a huge influence on it. I mean, if you read interviews with a lot of Japanese writers for manga and anime and such, yeah, somewhere in there, there'll be a reference that they're a huge gamer. Like it pretty much always, sometimes tabletop, sometimes video, usually tabletop, oddly enough. Yeah. Tabletop pops up a lot, and it tends to attract the storyteller types for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I see your point, and I agree with it, but here's my counterpoint, though. Okay, how do you write a story where the main character, how can I put this, the world isn't progressing with the main character? Like, how do you write a story where the main character is going up in level, but the universe is either falling behind them or there is already so far ahead of them, they might as well not be going up in level at all. You need to have that level curve that's going up with the main character. Otherwise, there won't be that sense of accomplishment. And there won't be that sense that the main character is facing challenge, really. He's either massively outmatched or outmatches everything around him.
Yeah, there's different ways because, again, I think historically a lot of the stories were written that the hero doesn't, if the hero progresses, it's a spiritual progression. Mm-hmm. It's not a technical progression.
Okay.
So, like, the Lone Ranger is a nameless lawman. His entire, squad gets killed. He's the only survivor. And now he's, one of the greatest gunmen in the West. He never has to improve his technique. He's just now one of the greatest gunmen in the West.
Right.
That kind of changes for us when you get to the 80s. And this is why you get the montage.
Well, that's just a sped up version of, okay, and now they're massive.
But
just a way to jump that. Sorry, so good.
I was going to say, but it delineates that point when they go up a level.
Right.
And I think, what were you going to say?
But I was going to say, well, because we want them to be massive, because we want to see them kick butt, and so we want that idea that they started off small, but we want that big fight at the end, and we can't have that big fight unless they've actually zoomed up in the levels to the point where they can have a real fight at the end.
Well, yeah, but again, that was kind of
and Kung Fu movies also had montages back before Rocky did too. That they're not the first person to have a fight montage, although everyone thinks of that.
It's true. Now, Rocky is exactly what I was thinking, because Rocky is kind of this weird gamification to a tragic degree.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see, because the first Rocky is a brilliant film.
It is.
And it's all about, like, Rocky's going to get his big break. He gets to fight the champ. It's a publicity stunt for the champ. And this is going to be another 40-year-old spoiler alert to those playing along at home.
Mm-hmm.
He trains. You see him training. You see his personal development. You see his struggle. He gets in the ring and he loses.
Yep.
But he goes the distance, and that's what made it like such a weird, unique, heroic movie. Rocky didn't just win until they did Rocky 2, which is basically Rocky again, but he gets the rematch because Creed's pissed off because everybody loves this schmo, and he says, I'm going to put him down for good, and Rocky wins.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you start seeing this weird like gamification formula kick in, because then they do like Rocky 3, where he's got to fight Clubber Lang, who's this even more awesomely powerful, like unstoppable boxer than Creed was.
Yep.
And Rocky's got to like montage, and he runs on the beach with Creed, and they have like a man hug at the end, and he gets his ass kicked first time, and he comes back and he ends up beating the even tougher villain.
Yep.
And then you get Rocky 4, where like it's this Russian death machine that's the product of like Russian science and Cold War technology, and Rocky's got to level up even more, and he fights and beats. And then the joke was after that, well, you know, he's established world peace. What next? Well, Rocky stops an alien invasion, and as I recall, that's actually how Predator happened.
Something like that, yeah. That's something like that.
Somebody, one of the guys who worked on Rocky 4 made that joke, and then they hummed and hawed, and eventually, maybe we can do like a muscle-bound guys fight an alien movie. But it's that idea that what you get is they're always upping that bar. You always need the next encounter is going to be like more powerful, not just different, not just like a different kind of, but that they're straight up more powerful. And eventually it just gets to ridiculous proportions. Like again, you look at the Rocky thing, and then they do like Rocky 5, and it's years later, and Stallone is now like 80. So you got to kind of, they kind of do it and do the idea that he comes back and there's another guy who's supposed to be like a badass, but Rocky's gone back to like first level. And I think that's why nobody liked it, because by that point we're climatized we want that progression, that every movie, the stakes are up, the threat's bigger, the hero has to like, you know, level up, and it becomes that trope, the montage, like training scene that like everything has.
Yep. And that is a problem. That progression issue is definitely an issue. And everything does that now, you're right. And it causes all kinds of weird problems. A good example of this that I always think of is the new Doctor Who. Now, when I say that, actually, okay, I should be more specific. David Tennant's reign as Doctor Who, okay? And I say that very specifically because the later ones, I think this happened as well, but David Tennant's Doctor Who, it was the first Doctor Who series where they started doing season arcs, right? And so what would happen is that Doctor Who would save London, okay? And then he saved the Earth, okay? And then he saved the universe, okay? And he saved multiple universes, okay? And then he had to save time and space itself. And then he had to save time and space and all reality for all time ever, period. And it went. And then the guy basically said, yeah, it's enough. I've written enough Doctor Who, I'm out. And he handed it off to someone else who started the cycle all over again with the new Doctor. That would be Matt Smith. Sorry, I blanked for a second there. And so that Doctor goes, and that's kind of the new standard, and they're kind of stuck with that in a weird way. Even Matt Smith kind of went through that cycle too. Actually, he did go through that cycle, if I remember right, because you've got this universe level character. Well, what's he going to save? The universe? Okay, but he can only do that so many times without it becoming kind of dull, right? So they keep just kind of resetting him back to first level with each reincarnation, and then they slowly work their way back up again until they run out of ideas. Then it's like, okay, reboot the Doctor.
Yeah, see, and that's where, like I say, it becomes that weirdly specific game-looking trope. Exactly. Because when you look at the classic Doctor Who,
they never did that. Ever.
Yeah, he saved the universe a few times, but it wasn't this feeling of upping the stakes. It was the Doctor was just always massive. he would come in, there'd be a new threat. It would be a different threat. He'd have to kind of clever his way to figure out what was going on and then, defeat the enemy.
Yep.
It wasn't that every season you had to feel that the Doctor was more massive in some way. He was always the Doctor.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of knew he was like super massive, but it wasn't that. And that's exactly it. They kind of start, because when you got, was it Eccleston?
Mm-hmm.
The hooligan doctor there.
Yes.
Those were done kind of more like regular Doctor Who stories.
Yes, they were. And in fact, his season, if I remember right, no, it does end with the whole Bad Wolf thing at the end, which there is a certain element of him saving time or space or something like that at the end of the first season, even there.
Mm-hmm. But it's small, and it kind of relates to like the Daleks, like making a reappearance. And then
yep, that's true.
You get to Tennant, and the first couple of seasons are kind of building a little, but when you get near the end of his run, they're doing these big stories. When you get to Matt Smith, he like literally has to reboot the universe.
Yep.
At one point, you could see that. I think that was when they did Capaldi there, the next guy.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of wanted to get away from that, but the audience sort of comes to expect it. And I think because you've done it and you've got that problem that, again, that's kind of the formula that we write to now.
Yep.
That
and the audience expects it, as you said.
Yeah. And not just for Doctor Who, but for especially the nerdly things, we kind of want to see there has to be bigger stakes. The hero has to be going up a level.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was one of the things I noticed when you mentioned like the Doctor Who, the brand new one.
Mm-hmm.
The stories that are written, it does feel like the Doctor is a first level Time Lord.
Oh yeah, they completely reset her.
Mm-hmm.
And Jodie Whittaker? Yeah.
But not just the Doctor, but like the threats are still more localized.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of playing, again, you can see they sort of wanted to reel it back to kind of like the classic era where like the monster is weird. It's not threatening the whole universe. I think that's one of the reasons they stressed in the first few episodes the idea that the Doctor is very sympathetic
mm-hmm.
and helps people. She actually has a speech she gives a couple times. And I think that's to try to do an end run around the audience expecting universal consequences, that you want to kind of put that idea that, and this is where the gamerification of story writing kind of has another weird thing, is in the Doctor, you want to put that idea that the no-name zero-level NPCs actually count.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you get to like the universal threats, crunching a few nameless bystanders just doesn't really seem to register anymore.
Well, yes, that's the problem, right? And or at least a lot of this problem is coming from the fact that the Doctor and even the pulp heroes you were referencing earlier, and like Lester Dent's bunch, and that they're not changing characters; they're unchanging characters. Like they're a fixed entity. So what you're doing instead is you're changing the world around them. Mm-hmm. Or in the case of things like Doctor Who, the reason the threats are getting bigger and bigger is they're pretending to change the world around them, is what they're actually doing. So you need to have these big, massive events because the world is not actually changing. The universe is not actually going to end. And you can't actually have any like serious, real consequences for the Doctor. Oh, sure, they play at it, but in the end, they just automatically revert back to the Doctor that they've been all along. So there's no real personal or psychological or whatever consequences there. But you want that feeling of change. Like the audience stories in general are about change. So there has to be some element of change. And so what they're doing is they're kind of just faking it. That's why they have to constantly have these bigger and badder threats, is because they can't change the setting and they can't really change the characters. So they're kind of doing a magic trick where they're waving their arms really, really fast. And they're hoping that if they wave their arms fast enough, you won't notice the fact that nothing has actually changed and that there's really no point to any of this.
See, and I think you've hit kind of one of the problems about having done this sort of thing for, say, like, I'd probably say since like late 90s, 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
Do you really, to do a fulfilling story, do you really have to have change in development?
That's a slightly different topic. But okay, let's dive into it. As far as we know, Okay? Stories are, at least according to my research that I've done for my books and such, stories are basically attempts at change. Okay? That's really what's going on. Because you've got a character a story is a character who takes an action, and that action has a result. That result is either going to be something has changed or something has not changed. Like, that's the most primal, basic form of a story. Okay?
Right.
I was hungry, so I went to the store and I bought a hamburger and I felt satisfied. That's a story. That's a complete story right there. We have a character, they did something, they got a result from that. And that's something that, the human brain can register. We can learn from that, that basic form. And then everything else is just, even War and Peace is just that, but super expanded out into like lots of details about why we reached the end that we did. Do you have to have change? The answer, of course, is no, you don't. But there has to be at least an attempt at change, and there has to be a sequence of events that explain why you got the end that you did. Does that make sense? It should, because at least apparently according to brain science, it does make sense. Read Wired for Story by Lisa Cron if you're curious about this and want to know more, folks. But the point is that we need at least the feeling that something's happening and that all of this is going to go somewhere, basically. It doesn't have to actually produce change, but we do need a series of events and some result that comes as a result of that series of events.
See, I think you've got the right idea, but I would change the terminology a little bit.
Okay, go.
I would say that you don't need change, but something happens.
Well, yes, something has to happen. That's the action part of that whole formula.
But I would say that that's really what you need, because if something happens, then you're going to get some kind of change. And I think what we've seen in the last 20 years, and this is kind of the trait we've been discussing, that something that happens, we've become climatized as an audience to think has to be some kind of progression.
Okay.
And I don't think it does to make a fulfilling story. And it's case in point, we've already mentioned Doctor Who. Look at classic Doctor Who. Things would happen, but there wouldn't necessarily be some kind of, I'm going to say, inherent progression, because there'd be consequence, there'd be results. But the Doctor ultimately is always the Doctor. Companions would come and go. There'd be a great deal of change for whatever setting the Doctor stumbled into, this series.
So see, the environment's changing.
And that's where I think I would say that something happens, because what I'm getting at now is we're sort of climatized that, if we don't see, a hero's journey, if we don't see the hero growing and developing, we instantly poop on whatever the story is. That's not, quote unquote, doing it the right way, even though doing it that way for most of entertainment is a relatively new thing.
Right. Well, I mean, for most of entertainment history, it was mostly, and still in some cases is just simply, the change is simply returning to the status quo.
Yeah.
Like a lot of stuff, like old Who, Pulp's detective stories, for example, the status quo has been knocked out of kilter, so to speak. Things are off balance, and the story is about how the hero restores balance. And that's basically how old Doctor Who functions. That's how a lot of things function. But restoring to the old balance doesn't necessarily involve change. There is change, but it's just a restoration of the way things should be. In the case of a murder mystery, or something like Castle or something like that, they find the body at the beginning of each episode. That shows that now there's an unbalance because there's a murderer on the loose who has not been brought to justice, so society is now out of balance. The characters go through their great journey of figuring out who's responsible for this, and at the end, they put the murderer in jail, thus restoring balance to society. No one has actually changed. Nothing has really happened except that things have just reverted back to the way they should be.
Yeah, now see, this is where I say I would use the term that something happened.
Right.
And then there's a result of that something happening.
Yes.
There's a murder, the detective solves it.
Yep.
Because again, like the terminology that you're using is heading down that game route. It's you're looking at it right out of the gate as some kind of development.
It is an attempted development. All stories are attempted development of some kind.
Yeah, I would, and that's where, like I say, I think I wouldn't like. I think that's wrong.
Okay, this is going to get interesting.
I don't think it's conceptually wrong, but like I say, I think using those terms frame it in the wrong light.
Okay. I know what you mean, but I'm not quite sure. This is going to be boring for our audience. I know what you mean, but I don't exactly know how to say it. I understand what you mean because, for example, I'm used to some like Japanese slice of life stuff, for example. Okay, right. Let's use something like that, for example. Which, so we have a slice of life story. Okay, so let's say a woman is sitting down at her desk. Okay, she sits down at her desk at her office. She reaches for her coffee cup. When she pulls it up and she's about to drink it, she realizes there's a spider sitting on the rim looking at her. And if this is a typical Japanese slice of life stuff, something will happen that's unexpected. So instead of like screaming and throwing it across the room, she kind of goes, "Huh," and she starts like poking at it and kind of like playing with the little spider a bit or something like that. And it's like, hey, here, little guy, you want some food or something like that? And just starts, having fun with the spider. And so, and then the last caption reads, and she didn't get any work done because she spent the afternoon playing with the spider. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that would be a Japanese slice of life story. Now, there isn't exactly progression as you're talking about going on there, right? Mm-hmm. We have a character who took an action, and then something unexpected happened. It's like, oh, hey, look, there's a spider here. And so the character made a choice. It's like, oh, okay, well, this is kind of cute. And so they start playing with the little spider or something like that. And that's the result of the way they chose to deal with this situation that came up, this little, unexpected surprise. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's not a story that actually has progression, not in the traditional Western sense, which is why that style of story, the Kisho Tenketsu is what it's called, confounds a lot of Western non-Japanese readers, and other people, because they don't quite know how to interpret that, because it lacks that kind of progressive change that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So obviously, I do understand what you mean by there's not always a progression there, but there was still a character, there's still an action that they're taking, and there is still an end result of what happens when they do that thing. Yeah. And that's all I'm trying to say. That's what a story is, basically.
Yeah, and because we had kind of a 3 argument about this with Jack. There's our Jack reference, talking about the hero's journey. Yeah. How everything doesn't have to be the hero's journey. And it kind of ties into that because I'll use the example if you watch like a classic sitcom.
Right.
Oh no, the beef didn't do his homework. And in the end, something happens and dad gives him money. No, beef, it's an important part of development that you'll have to do your homework. Well, gee, dad, I understand, but beef doesn't because he's going to do something dumb next episode. Yep. Because the thing is, the beef is just, as Wally would say, a dumb little kid.
Yeah.
And he's always a dumb little kid.
Yep.
And that's perfectly cool because we're tuning in just to watch him do dumb little kid stuff.
Yeah. And we do that every episode. And we don't want him to change. We want Beef to stay exactly the same.
Yeah. And he's not going to until like he's no longer cute and they bring him back. And now he's like an adult doing dumb little kid stuff, which is sad and disturbing. But
and they keep rebooting it 5 or 6 times. But anyway.
Yeah. But when you do that original, there's nothing wrong with that lack of development. Like that's just the kind of story it is. And it's a story. It's a valid story. Mm-hmm. But somewhere along the lines, and this is where I think this is one of these weird side effects of this more gamer style writing that kind of infused itself. We got this idea that that's totally wrong. That's totally unfulfilling. It should not be that way. At least if you're a critic, because they still make like sitcoms that are that formula and work that same way.
Oh yeah.
But amongst the literati, I guess, there's that idea that that's wrong. That's flat out wrong. Or you get that weird thing where people will try to say if it's something that's popular or they enjoy, they'll try to say, no, that's actually, there's development there. There's progression. He didn't learn a fucking thing because he's not going to do his homework 3 episodes from now again. But it's that idea that on the audience end, we've become climatized to expect that. It's the same thing with like the Doctor Who, that we've expected that the threat gets bigger, the Doctor's power gets more massive, and that's why they have to kind of do a weird end run when they bring that back down to quote unquote to Earth, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think some of that is the result of, well, okay, there are definitely 2 forces involved there. One of them is a reaction to generations of TV that had no change whatsoever, that was purely episodic, where nothing ever could change. Everything was static. So you got to remember that our whole our generation was a generation that grew up on television, and we dreamed of TV shows that would actually change and grow and develop. That was something that we dreamed of. The only time we ever saw something that even approached that was like TV miniseries. Or, occasionally a season of a show would have a cliffhanger that was like a big development. And then, of course, the first episode, the next season, it goes completely back to the way it was. And we're back to level 1 again. We're back to 0 again. So there's that. Also, they eventually realized something that audiences around the world have known for a long time. In fact, everyone's known this for a long time, which is that audiences love stories that progress. They love stories that change, and they love stories that progress. But I think what you're actually complaining about is not stories that progress, it's stories that are faking it. Okay? And that's what most modern television in North America does. And I'm referring to regular network television. I'm not talking about, say, Game of Thrones here, for example, where there is progression actually going on. Like, things are actually developing, people are living and dying, etc. They're following the Sopranos model, which came on the actual serial television model. But most television is faking progression, and they have been since like the early 2000s, maybe the late 90s, really. I mean, the grandmother of this, of course, was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where every season had the big bad, and that's what everyone calls it now. And because the truth is, that's how they're all written. They're all written exactly like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's always some big story arc that's going on in the background. Well, they have a whole bunch of episodes where nothing really important happens and nothing really changes. Because you can watch episode 3 and you can watch episode 19 back to back, and guess what? You don't really miss anything. You might miss a few minor details or something like that, but that's it. But that's how everything is written now. Because there's no real change. Like, all the change in the story is fake. It's all just reshuffling the deck chairs.
Right.
And then at the end of the season, they have some big event happen that seems really, really big, and then the characters manage to just stop it. And then, unsurprisingly, the next season starts and everything is back to exactly the way it was. Maybe the characters are a little tougher, maybe they're a little more capable than they were, but really, minor power level changes or something. But again, this is the formula that's been going on for like 20 years now, and people love it. I mean, or at least, well, that's, you run into problems though, because the shows can't actually change anything. And so the writers and usually they got about 2 good seasons of action and character and stuff that can that's driven and seems to be going somewhere and is interesting. And then usually about season 3 or 4, things can start to completely go off the rails, because at that point they're just making shit up to keep it going on. Yeah. And they're coming, okay, so here's the new bad guy of the week that's like, just like the last bad guy, but has a different colored uniform or something like that, and has a slightly different plan for why they plan to kill everyone or take over the world or something. Referring, of course, to like the CW shows, etc., or how they're going to destroy vampire society, or whatever version you're doing this. This is the new version of the game where there's fake change, but there's not real change.
Right.
Which is not bad itself. I mean, okay, fine, there's kind of, but the problem with it is that they're trying to have it both ways. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too. And so you end up with something that's not completely episodic, which would be perfectly fine, or not completely serial, which would also be completely fine, but something that has both the best and the worst aspects of both of them. Because they're constantly trying to convince you there's change, but even a 5-year-old child can watch that and go, there's no change here. There's no actual development really happening.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think you also get the weird thing too, like when you look at your more nerdly stuff, that it's that idea that they want to keep upping the hero's power level and doing like more massively awesome, spectacular things, but it eventually starts leading to some really awkward questions.
Mostly having to do with the fact that they don't have the budget to really show the hero their new power level.
Well, that and like the classic example I can think of that formula going wrong was Bleach.
Okay, how so?
Well, Bleach starts out and it's kind of a self-contained story, and it's this guy that can see like boogly monsters. They're like ghosts and stuff, and you find out there's this ancient group that like their job is to like fight ghosts and send them on to the afterlife, and okay, this is fine. And then the Spirit Council or whatever the
Soul Society,
who are in charge of this, they come under attack, and okay, well, I've seen this, and the bad guy shows up, and our hero Ichigo has to join in and learn their technique and helps fight off the monster. Okay, cool. And then like next season there's another group who are a bigger bunch of badasses that are threatened, and then they get beat. And then there's another, and you're like, well, this third group, shouldn't we, since they're like godlike in power, shouldn't we have heard about them before? And then you beat them somehow, and there's just another group, and it gets this weird, endless cycle of just a new villain, and then every season there's a new power you have to learn to beat that specific villain. And you're like, well, why didn't you just teach that to him 2 seasons ago, and we could have wrapped this up in a hurry, you know? And it leads to those kind of weird, awkward questions.
Yes, it does. Yeah. But again, they're just padding it out. They're just like, this really worked really well. They're referring to the whole Soul Society arc, which everyone who ever talks about Bleach, that's like their favoriteest thing ever, is the Soul Society arc. And they all pretty much universally agree, yeah, just stop watching Bleach after the Soul Society arc and you'll be much happier. Because what you're going to get is just an endless series of repeats of the Soul Society arc with different characters and slightly different plots and less backgrounds. At least for the comic anyway. Bleach, in case you haven't heard, folks, is the comic where at a certain point the author said, I don't really need to draw backgrounds anymore, and just stopped. Like literally the comics literally just don't have backgrounds anymore. They just have a horizon line basically. And there's no world around the characters. They're just them fighting each other.
That's true, because at one point they go to another dimension that's just basically, it's like a desert, so it's a line.
It's a line, yeah. That's his excuse. Oh, they're in another desert dimension, so it's just a line. It's like, and it's just watching characters fight with no backgrounds. I'm sure the background artist was pissed. He's like, what the fuck?
Fired.
And of course, Tite Kubo, I believe his name was. If it's probably like, dude, you're fired, get out. He saved himself a whole lot of money that day. So the point is that, but the background really didn't matter. And the ratings kept going down, and eventually the comic got canceled because they basically said, no one really likes this comic anymore. Just wrap it up. But because again, you can only keep doing the same thing so many times, and people will get tired of it. That's what we're running into with modern pseudo-serial television, is that they're just doing the same thing season after season after season, and the audience eventually catches on and just goes, I don't really like this anymore. I watched this this exact same thing 5 or 6 times. I'm kind of done.
Yeah.
But it's because the whole point again is it's that mentality of, we got to milk it as long as we can, and the audience likes this, so just keep doing more of that.
Yeah, I think you're starting to see it too with like movie franchises and that as well.
Mm-hmm.
That they keep upping the bad, and then they'll do a sequel with, and this bad guy's a bigger badass than the other bad. Really? And you didn't think to mention this to us before? And
it's going to be sorry to interrupt. It's going to be interesting after Avengers 4 comes out next year, because the Avengers have actually saved the universe at this point and killed off the universe's big bad. Yeah, good luck continuing your movie franchise, folks. Because like, okay, who are they supposed to fight next? Like we're now at Doctor Who levels again, where it's like, yeah, okay, maybe all of space and time, I guess, is what they're going to rescue next. I don't know.
Yeah, because what's the thing with Marvel? You can just it's another cosmic entity. They still have a bunch. Thanos isn't even one of their cosmic entities.
That's true. They haven't actually gotten to the truly cosmic entities yet. That is true.
But I think this is one of the reasons why you see too with like your Marvel franchises, not just with the movies, see even with like the TV shows, the cartoons and that.
Mm-hmm.
they're bringing in more and more of the secondary characters, and I think part of that is because they are kind of looking to scale things back.
Yep.
So if you can bring in, like, we'll make Hawkeye the hero, well, now you can scale it right back because he's just an asshole with a bow.
Yep.
So that works out really good. And if we introduce more of the street level characters, then we can keep our universe going from a slightly different point of view and not have to worry about, okay, so this time the Living Tribunal shows up. Oh no, what do we do this time? Kind of thing.
Yes and no. I mean, they presume Avengers team, at least for the movies in any way, from this point on, will include Doctor Strange and Captain Marvel, who they've already basically made clear is going to be like almost, God level herself. They're basically saying her up to be the strongest being short of the Hulk in the Marvel universe. Right. So, and then she's going to be on a team with like Hawkeye and Ant-Man. So I don't know how that's going to work, but whatever, or they are going to be on the team because Doctor Strange is also massively powerful. So I'm not sure exactly. I think they do want to focus more on the cosmic stuff because they realize that the Earthbound stuff is getting a little stale. So that's where that seems to be where they're headed for their next like generation of films.
Okay.
But we'll see. But actually, I think that, but again, as I've said many a time, I think after Avengers 4 comes out, I think that they're going to start to get diminishing returns on these like the superhero movies. I think we're going to start to see the end of this because people have kind of seen all the permutations. And It's like, okay, we've watched all this. We've watched 20 of these films, and we've now seen them go from fighting World War II bad guys to, saving the universe. Yeah, okay, that's kind of it. I think we're done. And, I mean, they'll keep doing it, and some of them will be okay, but I still think the modern audience is probably going to start to phase out at some point because everything goes, folks. Westerns went, and they were the most popular things on God's given earth for like 30 years. And then one day, they just disappeared. And superhero films will be the same. The scary thing that for me is that they will probably be replaced by anime remakes because that's the next generation that's going to be making the stuff that they grew up on.
Yeah, they're already doing that, aren't they?
They are. Battle Angel Alita comes out in 2 months.
Yeah, and wasn't there like a Western made Death Note live action series?
We don't talk about that. It wasn't a series, though. It was just it was a movie that was intended kind of to be maybe a pilot for a series, but I think it didn't quite work out, so I don't know if they're making another one. I don't know. Mm-hmm. They keep trying, but they haven't managed to make it work. But then again, they tried to make Marvel movies for most of the 90s, and most of them were stinkers and medium budget films that did okay, but only nerds liked.
You didn't like the Fantastic Four?
Oh. The point is, it wasn't until Iron Man came out in 2007, by which point they'd already made like a dozen or so Marvel movies before anyone went, wow, these are really good. And everyone went nuts for it, basically starting with Iron Man. So Marvel movies seem like automatic slam dunks now, but there were a whole bunch of stinkers before they eventually figured the formula out and made it work. And it'll be the same with anime remakes.
Yeah. Well, kind of too, though, because when Marvel did the Blade movies, those were pretty popular, but I don't think too many people realize that those were Marvel movies.
That's very true. Technically, Blade was actually, I think, the first big screen successful Marvel superhero in terms of popularity, basically.
Not Howard the Duck?
No, we don't talk about him. And the first X-Men movie, like the X-Men movies, did reasonably okay. And then there was the Spider-Man movie, which did actually quite well. That's true. I shouldn't say they were all stinkers. There were some movies that did okay, but they weren't great films. The first Spider-Man was pretty good, and the first Blade was pretty good, and the second X-Men was pretty good. But we won't talk about the rest of them. Anyway, but they didn't really kind of get the hang of this thing. And this is one of the reasons why, even though DC's been trying, they haven't been able to make the whole universe thing work for them. They've even given up on it. Yeah. They just said, screw it, we're just going to make superhero movies, and if they work, they work. If they don't, they don't. We're not building towards any super shitty universe because it doesn't fucking work, even though Marvel's just done 20 of them and it worked fine.
Yeah, and DC's secretly actually doing the movie Empire universe thing.
They are. They're just not, they're not announcing it because they're afraid that if it doesn't work, it's just not going to work. Because they tried that, it didn't go so well.
Yeah.
Anyway, so because Aquaman, which comes out here next week, will probably do perfectly fine for the sounds of it. And they have that and Wonder Woman. So next they can have Aquaman and Wonder Woman team up or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Although I heard most of their other Justice League movies actually got canned. I mean, even the guys who played Batman and Superman are both out, I've heard. So they don't even have them anymore to lean on.
I did hear they're working on a Plastic Man movie.
Like I said, they're kind of trying random shit at this point.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let's. I should stop swearing. We should get back on track. I do find the idea, though, that the universe is moving with the character fascinating. I think you're right. Like that's but at the same time, I do think that that's generally the correct way to do it. I mean, the other way to do it, I suppose, as you kind of intimidated, would be to basically say, okay, here's the universe at its full level, and this is what it actually looks like. Okay, here's our little character in his rinky-dink corner who's like level 1. Let's watch him, manage to get up to the point where he can stand with everything. And we could do a situation where he's purposely trying to avoid people that are more powerful than he is. I have seen this done. They know that they're actually rinky-dink, and so they're being very careful about who they fight. So instead of a universe that constantly seems to be matching the character, we've got the character matching the universe or matching what they can handle as they slowly progress. A lot of the Shanshaw stuff does that. And actually, I don't mind that. I kind of prefer it, actually.
Well, you know what the best example of that is?
Oh, what?
Star Wars.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, Luke stayed the hell away from Vader. Vader was badass right from the beginning, and Luke knew it, and he knew he couldn't take him, so he stayed away until the end, sort of.
Yeah, and that was the idea. It wasn't that like Vader got more powerful every movie. He was the pinnacle. He was the final boss, but he was up there from the beginning. Like it wasn't. It was, the whole story was about their meeting. That was what it was all built around, really.
Ultimately, it was about that confrontation between the father and the son and all that stuff. His hero's journey. There you go, Jack. So I think, but how is that different from a martial arts movie where the martial arts evil masters come in and kill the hero's family at the beginning, and the hero has to train and work his way up to eventually facing them at the end? That's not really any different.
It kind of is, because again, the kung fu films would set up that progression at the beginning. Like, you usually knew who the lieutenants were, and you knew what their ranking was.
Right, yeah. They made it very clear because you knew basically that's the order that the hero is going to try to tackle them, right?
Yeah. Whereas, like I say, our stuff here was usually there's a bunch of bad guys, one guy is awesome, and then the countryside is just kind of littered with the rest of them that you're sort of you're trying to get right to the main bad guy, but these other assholes keep getting in your way, kind of thing.
Yep. That's standard version, basically. I mean, or the Hokuto no Ken version, should I say?
A Hokuto no Ken is you wander around without moving your hips, and then you just run into random bad guys
who are already dead.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And if you have to dodge, I mean, you absolutely have to dodge. You do it by kind of turning your head a little bit.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, there we go. All right. So yeah, that's the Hokuto no Ken approach. But generally speaking, he was just dealing with endless levels of low level, common soldier guys, and then every now and then he'd encounter a boss who would think he had the upper hand for about 15 seconds, and then Kenshiro would inform him that he was already dead, and the bad guy would explode.
Yeah, and then because that was again a very Western style story, because up until they got to that idea of like Kenshiro's million brothers, every group of bad guys he ran into, they weren't getting progressively more powerful. They were just another bunch of these bad guys.
Because Kenshiro is already the pinnacle, and they made that very clear. So, again, it's back to that Righteous Avenger plot that I talked about earlier, where Business of the North Star stories are really not about Kenshiro. He's just there to deliver divine justice. The bad guys torture innocent people, and then eventually Kenshiro does away with them, and balance is kind of slowly sort of restored. And then he moves on to another post-apocalyptic town where the same thing happens over and over and over again. Keep in mind, Fist of the North Star was also written by a guy whose Japanese pen name is Buronson, who named himself after Charles Bronson, who of course was a Western gunfighter character. He loves them gunfights.
Mm-hmm. And that's what it was. Like Kenshiro's the Hooked no Ken is basically like the old like spaghetti westerns.
He's the man with no name, basically. Mm-hmm. He's who gets beat up a little less, but overall, he wanders from place to place and uses his badass skills to bail the locals out. I mean, that's the Western formula. Yeah,
but the thing that if that was written nowadays, every 3 episodes we'd see him having to learn something new to beat like this villain because he's more powerful.
Exactly. What was done these days, yeah, you're about right. Or he'd have to learn some new trick to deal with the next major bad guy.
Mm-hmm. Which he kind of does, but but the running thing was he didn't have to learn them. It was just that this martial art was just so crazy overpowered that whatever he ran into, he had some specific technique that was designed just to deal with this one specific guy, it seemed like.
Yeah, basically. I mean, he would be at a slight disadvantage while he figured out what this bad guy could and couldn't do. And then as soon as he figured it out, it was just over.
Yeah.
And that's the formula. And okay, yeah, it was a pretty good formula. It works very well. I mean, but as you say, until we get to Rao and the other brothers, that's kind of it.
Yeah.
Because there's no one who can face him.
Yeah. And then it turns into Dragon Ball that, you know, but I must learn this technique and practice this, and then my rating goes up even higher. But to
go back to what we were saying earlier, though, progression itself is not actually a bad thing. In fact, I think progression is the natural way stories are told. I think it's just the problem is pseudo progression or fake progression is what's, I think, driving you and many people nuts. It's the idea that there has to be this weird attempt at progression, whether there really is or not. Or lip service to it, I should say.
Yeah, that, and then the other thing that bothers me nowadays is that progression is always done a very specific way. And it's very, like, again, it's that like role-playing game version that you can literally watch the characters going up in level like they would in a game. And it starts feeling kind of arbitrary after a point.
Right. Okay. I can see that. Now,
especially the idea that the universe has to get more massive to deal with the hero.
Well, because the hero has to be challenged, so the universe has to balance in some way. I mean, that's just natural as part of the story.
But it's that idea that like new massive threat, in a lot of cases, we should have been aware of a lot. Like that would go back to like the older formula.
Yeah, pretty much.
That we'd know who the top villain was, and we'd have a rough idea of who the dickweeds in that were and where they stood from the beginning. It wasn't that I have like beaten I've beaten Vegeta, and then this other guy shows up from out of space, and then I beat him, and this other guy shows up, and then there's these other more powerful guys after that, and then this and you're like, where are they coming from?
But again, that's kind of a throwback to some of the old stuff, though, where every episode, the main villain sends out a new lieutenant to try to stop the hero.
Yeah, they do, but again, it was that idea with the older stuff that you knew who the top end was.
That's true.
Like, to put it in superhero context, Lex Luthor was going to have another evil plot.
Yeah. That's true.
He was going to have another evil gimmick that Superman would beat, but Lex Luthor himself wasn't raising his gadgetry level every book. He would just come up with something new that was weird. You knew that Lex and Superman in their own ways were already evenly matched, and if it ever came down to a direct like duel between them, it wouldn't be definitive, or that would be the end of the story. That again, it wasn't that Superman had to get more massive he'd get weirder powers, because that was, in the Silver Age. But that would usually be part of the story. It wasn't that he was going up a level every couple of stories, and Lex would go up a level, and eventually it would lead to that confrontation. It was just they were at their points, and that's where they were, and they represented the pinnacle of that universe.
Right, yeah. We're watching these two gods have a chess game with each other.
Yeah, but they don't get more godlike every story.
Right.
It's just they're already kind of there.
And that's a perfectly good way to tell stories. I mean, it's not one that we do so much anymore, but it is a perfectly good way to do it. I mean, there are other approaches, like there's the traditional Star Trek approach, where every episode...
Tachyons?
What?
Tachyons?
Tachyons, exactly. Every episode, thanks to tachyons, things kind of reset. They automatically meet some aliens that are exactly at the right level to do what needs to happen for the story. And but the Enterprise is encountering lots of different guys. There's not really, we're encountering this guy and then these more massive guys and these more massive guys. Traditional on Star Trek, it was usually just they encountered different guys each week, and that was kind of it. They had different stories and different encounters, and some of them were tougher than others, and some of them were weirder than others, but that's kind of how it was. Early on, I mean, by the time they got to Deep Space Nine and Voyager, they did actually start to have a progression going on, though, where they were encountering progressively worse bad guys.
Yeah, and they were progressively upping their abilities, because that was like the original Star Trek. You might run into a bunch of cavemen this episode, and next episode you're arm wrestling Apollo.
Mm-hmm.
The Enterprise crew themselves, again, didn't necessarily progress. It was a big universe, and the threat levels varied depending on who you encountered or what the problem was that week.
Right, yeah.
And you're right that by the time you get to, say, like the 90s shows, they were doing that thing where they were always upping that threat level. Now, at that point, it was kind of a new way of doing stories, but every season ended with the coming of the more powerful villain, and they kept getting more and more, and then you run into that problem that eventually you start hitting kind of the logical limits of your setting.
Yeah. Well, Voyager solved that problem by constantly going to new settings, right? But for some reason, the closer they got back to home, the more badass all the aliens became.
Well, yeah, Voyager was a weird one because they did something pretty smart towards the end. And it was because it was that progression. You started with what was it, the Kazon, which were Klingons with bad hair. And then it was like every episode it was like, the Borg. And then it was those weird CGI reptile kind of things that like hated the Borg and were more massive than the Borg. And then they kind of put a halt to that because they started doing the stories about the sucky baby alien and the kid. Yeah.
Well, they just changed the focus of the show.
Yeah, and those were good. And then they started doing stories about the characters in the last couple seasons. And those were really good because you got to see these like weird, different, interesting things. You didn't have to worry about ever increasing power levels until the very last part of the show, where it was like, and all of a sudden, like, we're almost back to Earth and all hell breaks loose and everything's massive and fight.
Well, they did. That's how Voyager ends. Spoiler. Again, 40-year-old spoiler, no, 30-year-old spoiler in this case. But that is how Voyager ends. I mean, they discover that the Borg are finally going to, assault Earth and everything like that. And anyway, then they stop it. But you're right. I mean, they reached the point, I think, especially once they hit the tripod reptilian aliens that could like tear the Borg apart. They basically realized that the Voyager was an ant among giants, basically, and they realized, we can't really do this progression thing anymore. We better do something else. And so that's why they focused on something else, which is the occasional encounters with badass aliens from that point on.
And that was like Deep Space Nine as well, where eventually they meet basically God.
Kind of, yeah.
And then you find out that the main character basically is God. And you're like, okay, this is strange, but sure,
right?
I guess. But you could you can get away with that if there's like an end.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, right? towards the end, you can actually have real progression happening because you don't have to stretch it out like a piece of silly putty anymore and elongate it. You basically, it's like, okay, this is the end. We can actually work towards the end. And that's where things start to really kick in and get interesting again, because you're actually now watching real progression instead of fake progression.
Although sometimes even then, because I remember with Voyager, when they did the end of the series, there was a lot of stuff that they did to wrap things up that you're like, where the hell did that come from?
Yeah.
Like there was the one where the Borg and the first officer guy, I can't remember their names.
Oh, Chakotay and 7 of 9.
Yeah, where they ended up together because they were in love. And you're like, we saw absolutely no sign of this at any time during the series except the last episode. You're like,
well, they have to give them something to do, I guess, or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, there was a few things because I got the impression they sort of realized, oops, wait, we neglected like most of these characters. And then to have kind of an ending to their story, you had to kind of give them their story at the beginning of the episode and then wrap it up for the finale.
Pretty much, yep. Actually, that's something I've begun to hate is ensemble shows. They're really something I find incredibly annoying, and I'll tell you why. This goes back to my comment earlier about you get about 2, maybe 3 good seasons and then everything goes to hell. It's because, not just because of the fake progression, but because with an ensemble show, what's happening is you have all these characters, and so at first you're like getting to know them all, and so they all have their own stories, and they all have their own shit that's going on, but eventually you run out of stuff for those characters to do. You've basically explored those characters, usually by the time you get to season 2 or 3. And so they're like, how do we solve this problem? We add more characters to the cast. And so they just progressively, every season or every 2 seasons, they just add more characters to the cast, to liven up the mix. But they don't get rid of any of the old actors. And so you've just got this ever-growing cast bloat going on of these characters. Right. And by the way, because they're all under contract and they're all, main characters, you have to give them all time every episode. So Arrow is a beautiful example of that, to go back to a CW show. But again, this comes from Star Trek. This has been going on for a long time. Buffy has this problem too. But I'm going to use Arrow as a good example. When Arrow starts, it's a show about one dude. Okay? It's about him. And eventually he picks up another dude who's his support team. Okay, that's it. It's just the 2 of them. Then they pick up a chick. And then they pick up another partner. And then they pick up another character. And then they pick up another character. By the way, no one's leaving. And then they pick up another character. And then one does actually finally leave. And then they decide, what they decide? It's like, wow, we've got too many people. So they get rid of 2 people and they add 4 more. And it's like, so it's just this constant attempt to rotate. And every episode they have to come up with some bullshit excuse for every character to appear in the episode, because they all got to appear in the episode or they don't get paid. And they're paying for all these characters. And why are they doing this? Because drama is cheap. So every now and then they throw in action sequences and they do stuff, but 90% of the show is still a drama with people arguing with each other or, unhappy about things, who, by the way, will figure everything out usually by the end of the episode.
Right.
And this is something that a reason I don't like ensemble shows, or I've come not to like them, is largely what I talked about cast bloat. But also because the show tends to just, lose its focus. Like, if you have a show where there's just a very small core cast and then other people come and go and everything, that's fine. That's okay. But when you're doing a show that's really just about these 7 people and permutations of these 7 people arguing with each other, that's interesting for only so long. Okay. Or funny for only so long, because that's also what a sitcom is, basically.
Yeah.
They're using the same form. But sitcoms at least don't try to pretend to progress or go anywhere. Like,
no, they do.
Modern
there's
ones
a lot of
kind
sitcoms that do that.
Sort of. I mean, they'll do things where like there'll be kind of slow progression, which usually amounts to something that happens during sweeps week once or twice a season.
Yeah, I think part of what ended up bringing that to sitcoms was Friends.
Yeah, I can see that.
Because they started pairing them up, and it would they end up together? Would these end up together? And then that starts you down that road of development, which you kind of can't really do.
Yep.
But I've seen a few sitcoms for the amount of time I can watch them, that there's that weird need for progression.
some of it, though, is a human need. Like I said, we kind of like these characters and we want to see them in some way, maybe just through their relationships, kind of move forward in their lives. Like we see characters with wants and needs, like who are lonely. We want to see them find someone to, like hang out with and such, or, to have a relationship with. And so we do want to see that character hook up with another character and maybe have a good relationship, or maybe it doesn't work out, and that's okay. I don't mind a story about characters where the main character has relationships with one person for a season or two, and then it doesn't kind of work out, and so they break up, and then they have a relationship with another character. That's fine. I'm totally okay with that. But there are different kinds of sitcoms, though. I mean, there are sitcoms that are a little more a drama sitcom, and where needs to be some actual progression, things happening. And then there's other sitcoms that are more static, where they're not really supposed to change. And any change that happens should be very light and very minimal.
But the weird thing is, in the last 20 years, they've started writing ones that are supposed to have a development.
Well, they're pretending to. They're paying lip service to it.
Yeah, well, they kind of do, but it works really weird, because that was like The Big Bang Theory with Dave Cousin Oliver does that too, that they actually would add relationships and things would progress, and you're starting to kind of wrap up some of the characters to the point that in the last, say, season or so, because they're all married off now, they don't really do nerdy things.
Right.
Because the idea is you outgrow that when you start having the kids and stuff. There's, what was it, Two Broke Girls? They literally had a counter at the end of every episode, because the two of them are trying to start a business, of how much money they've made towards starting their business.
Okay.
So it's a sitcom written from the premise of development. It was what was the one with Doogie Howser? That wasn't Doogie Howser. It was How I Met Your Mother.
Oh, yes, that one. Yeah.
That the running gag was you don't know which of the characters that he's interacting with ends up being the kid's mom.
Right, yeah.
And that's a show written with the premise of development, that you're going to lead up to some big finish right from the, and that's really weird for sitcoms. And it kind of sort of works, because the problem is, even if you're conceptualizing an end or a progression, you're going to keep dragging this thing out as long as people watch. So you never know when that progression is going to end. That's
the problem with what they're doing with, say, Two Broke Girls. I can immediately see that we'll see the money go up and down, and maybe there'll be a very slow progression as they go on. And then when it's time to end the show, suddenly one of them will get knocked up by a billionaire, and suddenly they'll have the money to do what they want. The end.
Well, I think they already started it, but you're right that there'll be some weird obligatory finish, because it's that weird thing. And again, I'm not exactly sure how to take it in the great cosmic scheme of things. That idea that it's nice to do a finish, it's nice to lead to a conclusion, but you kind of don't always have to.
Yeah, some things are not meant to actually have an end.
Yeah, some things can just stop. And I think, again, that became around the same time we were talking, when you got to the 90s and that, and especially last 20 years, the finale of even a sitcom was a big deal. So they had to do some kind of story-based, wrap it all up kind of deal, and it usually ended up being a little odd. MASH did it. It was the biggest thing on television.
It literally was, because it was the most watched thing in television history, at least in terms of TV drama, I think, ever up until that point, and is still one of the most watched things ever, actually.
Yeah, and then that kind of went away for a decade, and then you got to the 90s where, you get to the late 90s, it starts coming back, and then now that's a thing.
Well, remember that a big part of the whole idea of you don't want to end it is for syndication purposes. Because you want to have these stories be able to run in any order, and for it to just be perpetual, because it's meant to run in daily strip syndication where they're showing 5 episodes a week at 7:30 or whatever, and you just keep running it, and it's meant to kind of run in an endless loop. So you don't want anything resembling an ending to it.
Yeah, until you get to that final thing, and that's where I say it always feels kind of weird because a lot of them wrap up a lot of stuff that you didn't know was there.
Yeah, that's true.
Or they wrap it up in a hurry. Like I remember that was the thing with Cheers. Mm-hmm. That the Cheers finale, it just sort of wraps up in a hurry.
Yeah, that's it.
Like the one character, I forget her name because I'm not a sitcom fan.
Is it Diane?
The last like female love interest.
Oh no, you're right. Diane goes, and then I can't remember her name. It's been too long.
I can't either. But at the end, she's like a gold digger through the whole series. At the end, she marries a plumber. She's distraught and is like, "Oh, I guess I married a plumber." Okay, that's okay. It's an end, sure. And then a lot of Cheers wrapped up that way. And if you watch it, the overall feeling of that show, the last episode is just give up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Cheers was just about perpetualness, though. That was the whole point of Cheers. It was a place where everyone knows your name, and these characters who live in endless loop of a life, kind of like the Friends characters in a way, just exist there, and they interact there, and occasionally weird, funny things will happen to them and such. But It's just about the denizens of this bar where nothing changes, and it's comfort. That's what it's there for. It's meant to be kind of like comfort entertainment food. Mm-hmm. And so it is weird for it to have an end in a way. They should just, I don't remember exactly what happens, but the best ending for that kind of show really is just life continues and life goes on and more people come and other people go, and that's just the way it is. The end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Until you bring it back for the sequel 20 years later.
Oh, I'm sure they've tried. Well, they're all the actors I think are still around. So not sure. I shouldn't say all of them. The old guy died a long time ago. I think the other actors are all still alive. So do expect a Cheers reunion at some point in the near future.
Yeah, but the problem is if you bring back Woody Harrelson after all the parts he's played recently, he's the guy that comes into the bar with the shotgun and kills everybody. Although I'd watch that. Yeah. I have to be honest, I would watch that.
Yep, there we go.
Woody just finally snaps.
Yep. Woody's finally had enough. Yeah, and he was called, even the character was called Woody. So yeah. There we go. Well, okay, so we should probably bring this on to an end. So I guess the question becomes, so what? So things are becoming things have become very gamified, and there's definitely a sense of progression, or at least pseudo-progression, is something that modern audiences expect. And if they don't get it, they get really unhappy because they get restless if there's no progression, because that's something they feel should be there, whether it really should be or not. Yeah. Okay, that's how we do it now. So what?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the problem you run into is it's a double-edged sword.
Okay, how so?
Because it's like we were saying, you get that progression, but the problem is that progression takes you somewhere, and then you're there, and it may not be somewhere you intended to go. Mm. So now you've got to deal with a whole new set of circumstances that your original concept may not have been intended to deal with.
Right. Well, whether they want to or not, I mean, stories evolve, especially if they're playing out. Even ones that are meant to be static will evolve because the actors change, the writers change, the directors change, producers change. Change will happen for one reason or another. They can do their best to fight it, but the change always comes. And I think I just gave a movie speech, but I don't remember which one. Anyway.
It doesn't matter. That speech will get changed when they reboot it.
Oh, okay. Problem solved. Okay, so... Oh, wait, no, that's Thanos' speech from the last Avengers movie. Actually, I just gave Thanos' speech. Well, there we go. Okay, so run from it, fight it, the run from it, hide from it, fight it, or something like that. Change always happens, something like that. Anyway, but the point again is that, I mean, speaking of change, though, this is how we're doing it right now. Eventually, we'll find another formula, and we'll move on to that. And if history is any way to judge, and it usually is, the formula we're heading for is something that's even more like video games than what we've already had. because that's what the current generation, as we started off talking about, has literally grown up on, and they're the ones who are going to be writing the next generation of stuff.
It's true, but remember that a lot of people, the video games they play are like those, like your equivalent of the old 8-bit, like your phone games, which a lot of those tend to be perpetual. So maybe the next big thing will be the old school sitcom where nothing actually happens and nobody really minds.
I'd buy that for $1. Sorry.
Even the movie quotes.
Exactly. Well, everything's cyclic, right? So therefore, it's a given that at some point episodic is going to come back into vogue.
Yeah.
At some point, people are going to want more episodic television, and they're going to get tired of these endless pseudo changes that go on. But the thing is, the entertainment industry is a little bit slow to react to these things, so it might take a little while before it happens. And to be honest, as a child of the 80s who grew up with episodic TV, I'm not really sure I want it to come back. I mean, I do appreciate more static stuff. I appreciate it for its value, but at the same time, even when I watch old stuff, I kind of get a little restless sometimes where I'm like, okay, this is happening, but it doesn't really mean anything. I still want that sense that the story is actually progressing towards something. Like I have gotten used to that in a way. I mean, I can still appreciate like old Trek, for example, and old 80s TV shows for what they are. But at the same time, there's a part of me that goes, well, yeah, but so what? Like, where is this going? And the answer is it's not going anywhere because it's not supposed to.
Yeah, I guess. Now, my take on it, though, is the episodic thing doesn't bother me because I'm watching this to kill some time. Like, I'm watching it for cheap yachts.
Right.
So it doesn't have to have. And that's where I think that the modern audience, by hook or by crook, has been climatized to that we want at least enough to convince ourselves that what we're partaking of has some substance to it.
I think ultimately I would prefer if we move to the model that, ironically enough, a lot of the planet uses. Not just Japan uses this, and a lot of the planet uses. In which case we did shorter series, but that just had an end. Like shows that they're literally designed to run 1, 2, 3 seasons, and that's it. It's just that's the end. That's the whole story. It's over. We move on to something else. I mean, in Asia, for example, like Korean dramas, Taiwanese dramas, Chinese dramas, and that almost all of them are designed. They're really their equivalent to soap operas is what they are, but they're really designed to run for 40, 50, 20, whatever episodes. They run an entire story during that time, and then they're done. And we move, and the audience moves on, everyone moves on, the characters are done. They might rarely do a sequel of something super popular, but more likely the audience will simply tune into the next thing that those actors are in, but which isn't them playing the same characters. It might be them playing characters that are similar, but the audience has to follow actors as opposed to specific series. I mean, I know why Americans don't do this. It's because the American model is designed to be a factory, an assembly line, and to be freaking cheap. It's a very economical, very cost-effective way of doing things.
Yeah.
But even in Argentina and Mexico and African countries and that, they have gotten, well, actually, correction, I shouldn't say gotten. Even they do shows that are really just last 1 or 2 seasons and then they're done. I mean, it's not because the show got canceled. It's because they're only designed to be that long.
Yeah, the Brits did that for the longest time.
Well, the Brits have always done a mix of it, right? Where the Brits will do weird things. Actually, the Brits will do really weird things where they'll do like seasons that are 3 episodes long. Or they'll do seasons that are actually just 2 or 3 movies. That's been popular for the last decade or so. And then if they do more, okay, that's fine too. I mean, that occasionally happens. But most Brit stuff does seem to be designed to, whatever season they're doing is effectively the last season. And if they do more, that's fine, but they're not really planning for it. That's pretty common for them.
Yeah.
Which I think is also not a bad approach. Again, it depends on what kind of programming you're doing. Something that's like a murder mystery series doesn't need to have progression. In fact, it actually that works against it, really, to have progression. And people don't really want it, so why do it anyway? But something that is more dramatic and is about a character growing and improving should have real progression. And cheating the audience out of it is just annoying.
Right.
At least that's my take on it anyway. So that's what I'm hoping for, is that we start moving towards that model where we just start doing shows that are only like meant to be a few seasons tops, maybe in just one season, done, story's over, move on.
Yeah.
Maybe with all these streaming services, we will actually start to see more of that because it's more economical for them to do it that way.
Yeah, it is. And I think a lot of the different streaming services that they buy X number of episodes, and I can see writing to that.
Yep, exactly. Actually, one that's just finished this past week actually is the Voltron series that Netflix did, which I have to say is really good. They did a great job with it overall. There's a few quibbles here and there I've got with it, but that can be another show or something, whatever. But the point is that they basically were told up front, you got 80 episodes. Do what you want with that. We're paying for 80 episodes. And so they wrote to 80 episodes, and it actually really shows. They did a great show because of that. They didn't have to worry about being canceled or anything halfway through. Sure, they did make some changes on the fly. A few things happened that they didn't expect, but that was more due to fan reaction and other things that were, off camera. But they still did 80 episodes, and it's a full, complete arc, and it all works.
I wonder if that's going to become a thing, though, 80 episodes. Because isn't that Rick and Morty too?
Yeah, for some odd reason, they just signed up for, I think it was 70 episodes, but something like that too. I have a funny feeling it's some kind of weird syndication number or something, like back in the old days.
Maybe, but Rick and Morty, we know why, because we know how the series ends now.
It doesn't.
No, it does. We know how it ends, because that's why they renewed it for I think you're right. I think it was 70 episodes.
Okay, why?
Well, because that was the beginning of season 3 when Rick freaks out, talking about the Szechuan sauce. And I'm going to get it, Morty, even if it takes 70 episodes, I'm going to get you. So we know how the series ends.
Oh, okay.
He gets a Szechuan sauce.
I always assumed it was going to end with Morty becoming Rick or something weird like that. But okay, maybe that'll work too.
That would be disturbing.
Well, I mean, there's kind of even been some, I think anyway, hints to that effect. But again, maybe I'm just interpreting things weird. I don't know. Who knows? On that note, I think I'd better go before I start rambling because we're already talking about Rick and Morty. So, thank you everyone for listening. I know this episode has been a little discombobulated at times, but hopefully it made some kind of sense and we didn't repeat ourselves too endlessly. It is an interesting way to look at things. I think probably there were some other gamification aspects that we probably could have talked about, but we kind of got on to the progression arc and kept focusing on that when we didn't even talk about some of the character tropes that come in with gamers and such. I guess we kind of did, but anyway, who knows? Yeah. TV is going to become... Sorry, go.
Oh no, I was going to say, because that's basically what the key was, that so many things have adopted that gamer style progression in that you get that weird amping up of the power level and the threat level of your setting.
Exactly. But I really don't think there's much we can do about it. We just have to wait for the interest in that kind of style to pass. Like everything else, this too shall pass. Mm-hmm. And there'll be a robot apocalypse, but that's beside the point.
Either that or we're left to wonder where all the orcs went.
Indeed. Good night, folks. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya!